I'm very pleased to introduce you to Molly Dahl. Molly is Chief of the Long-Term Analysis Unit in the Labor, Income Security, and Long-Term Analysis Division at the Congressional Budget Office. In that capacity, she leads the preparation of the agency's annual population, labor force participation, and long-term budget projections. She also leads the work on the longitudinal microsimulation model used to project Social Security spending and revenues over 75 years. And I will turn it over to Molly, who will introduce the rest of our panel, which is going to follow more of a fireside chat type of model. So, yes. Thank you.
That's right. Before we get started, though, I wanted to thank CEPR and the staff. This has been an incredibly interesting and informative day. Hopefully we will continue that tradition. And has been incredibly well run, despite the near catastrophe of like a late meal, which is a crisis in such a situation. Handled beautifully and particularly and very well done. So thank you. I have with me, oh yeah, I agree. So I have here on the stage with me Kathleen Romig, who's the Director on Social Security and Disability Policy at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and Jason Fichtner, who is the Vice President and Chief Economist at Bipartisan Policy Center. And as Gopi said, this is going to be more of a fireside chat. They have assured me that it will be a fun fireside chat as opposed to a contentious fireside chat. So a lot of what I'm about to say in the introduction we've heard already, but I just want to, if anybody's joining online or slept through the whole first sessions. So we're talking about Social Security program, and the fiscal situation and outlook for the Social Security program is indeed challenging. We're talking about exhaustion dates within about a decade. And at that time, if we see an across-the-board benefit cut, we're talking about a benefit cut of potentially over 20%. There's a lot to discuss here. As Gopi said, we're standing between people in the reception, so we want to go ahead and get moving. So Kathleen, I think you were going to talk through first some discussion points on payroll tax options and how we might reform payroll taxes. Jason, you're going to comment, and then we're going to go to you, Jason, to talk about benefit changes.
Great. Yes. Hello. I'd like to start by addressing a common misconception about the politics of Social Security, which is this idea that Social Security is the third rail of American politics. If you touch it, you will get burned. And I honestly don't think that's true. I think we need to be a little bit more precise. I think that it's very clearly true that if you cut it, you will face pretty severe political consequences. And we're seeing that right now. We saw it at the State of the Union this year. And again, President Biden raised the specter of Social Security cuts, not changes. And as Deb said, there's a lot of interest, in fact, in strengthening Social Security's finances. When you poll voters, it's consistently one of the top 5 things that they want people to want Congress to address. That was true in the midterm elections when there was an awful lot of more immediate things happening. It was still in the top 5. So people very much want a solution to Social Security. They want a strengthened program, but they do not want to have their benefits cut. And so with that, I want to present you a few payroll tax options, because that's the other side. We talk so much about the benefit side of things, but sometimes these tax things are just not discussed. And so what I want to talk about first is something that's come up an awful lot today in our discussions, which is increasing increasing inequality in general. We have increasing wealth inequality, we have increasing wage inequality, and we have increasing longevity inequality. All of these things impact people's retirement security. And so since we're focusing on payroll taxes to start, thinking about the increasing wage inequality. As Louise explained this morning, this is not something that the policymakers of 1983 expected. And back in 1983, the Social Security payroll tax covered 90% of earnings in the economy. And thank you for doing the slides, Jason. But that's really changed, So look at this graph that the tax cap cut 10% of wages back in 1983 were above the cap. Now 17% of wages are above Social Security's payroll tax cap. And as you can see in the bottom line, about the same number of workers have earnings above that cap, but the gap between these two lines is growing because of that growing inequality. And so 7% of aggregate wages in the US economy is a lot of money. And that money is now not taxed as it would have been if the Social Security tax cap had stayed at 90% of wages in the economy. And as Deb said, Social Security's actuary has estimated that simply pegging it to 90% of wages in 1983 would have given us an additional 50 years of full financing of the program from here to 2075. We wouldn't be here talking about Social Security solvency had we done that in 1983. So I think that's really important. And we can still do it now. We wouldn't want to do it all at once, of course, but the Bowles-Simpson Commission, a bipartisan commission about a decade ago, did look at an option that would have gradually increased the payroll tax cap to once again cover 90% of earnings in the economy, and then keep it there. They would have also replaced some of those earnings above the current cap, but not as generously as those earnings would be replaced under the current system. And that alone would close 20% of Social Security's long-term financing gap. So that's one option. That's a very popular option, by the way, the most popular solvency option when you poll voters. Another thing on the payroll tax side that we could do is broaden the base. One way to do that, of course, is bringing more workers in. I'm sure we'll talk about that later. But another is the types of compensation. And this is another thing that Louise brought up this morning that was not necessarily anticipated in 1983, that we see a lot more non-wage compensation these days than we did in 1983. So the rising cost of health insurance premiums as a percentage of compensation has doubled since 1983. The increase in so-called cafeteria plans that cover things like flexible spending accounts, those essentially didn't exist in 1983. Now 40% of workers have access to them. Those are not taxed by Social Security. And if we did, if those were subject to the payroll tax as well, another bipartisan commission around the same era as Bowles-Simpson, the Rivlin-Domenici Commission, which Jason's employer convened, they suggested applying the payroll tax to those fringe benefits, treating them similar to the way that we treat 401ks. And on the health side, that would close 1/3 of the gap. And for the cafeteria plans, that would close 1/10 of the gap. And then finally, and most simply changing the rate. As Bill mentioned, the rate has been frozen in amber for the last 33 years, and that was not true historically. As the program expanded, as we brought in new types of benefits, survivors benefits, spousal benefits, disability benefits, as benefits became more generous over time, as more people came into the system at the beginning, and we'll talk more about this legacy debt as well, but as more people came into the system, as more beneficiaries each year came into the system, we gradually raised taxes, and then boom, 1990, it hasn't changed since. If we simply change the payroll tax rate by 1 percentage point, it chipped an additional 1% of wages, that would close 25% of the gap. And that was another thing that the bipartisan Rivlin-Domenici Commission proposed. And it wouldn't be a huge deal for most workers. For someone earning $50,000, about an average wage, it would be an additional $10 out of every biweekly paycheck. And the employer would also chip in another $10. So this is not something that's going to have huge effects on people's pocketbooks or huge effects on the labor force participation. We're talking about a fairly modest change. And if you've been keeping track at home, I just solved 9/10 of the problem. So it can be done. And this is through a pretty traditional, keeping Social Security's traditional structures and not cutting a single dime of benefits.
So I was very fortunate they agreed to let me control the clicker, which means I get to move backwards and forwards as I please. Keep in mind the context. So one of the things we want to talk about, this is just for OASI, the retirement program. The trust fund depletion date is now 2033. HI is 2031. When you start thinking about the combined programs, a lot of times the media talk about OASDI together. They are separate trust funds. The DI program itself is now solvent to 2097, so it's outside the 75-year window, but it's very sensitive to economic conditions. One recession, that number could be right back down to depletion date being quite early. If you use all of the trust fund reserves, basically payroll taxes that go for DI and trust fund reserves, for the DI trust fund, it buys you 1 year of retirement solvency, which is why the combined trust funds go depleted in 2034. This is the gap. That black line you see horizontally solid, that is what is called payable benefits. The line above that is what's scheduled. We're trying to pay if we don't make any changes. We got to make up that delta somehow. And there are basically two ways to do this in broad categories. Bring in more revenues, reduce outlays. That means reducing benefits. How you do that is the question. And that's what we're talking about today. So we're going to start with these big categories and move down to some more specifics. But that's kind of important. We have talked about the idea of what it means to delay, the cost of delay. These are the various depletion dates from the trustees' reports from 2003 to 2022. And I think we got some ones cut off. But what you'll see is there's a very narrow range, which for the last 20 years, we can tell you between somewhere 2027 and 2042 or so, the trust funds are going to be depleted. We've known about this for 20 years or more. We just haven't acted. And that's one of those behavioral economic insights where the problem always seems so far away. It's not urgent. Congress, of course, hasn't acted. We've seen Congress so far is very good at waiting until the last minute to respond. And I think that's something to keep in the back of your mind as we start talking about policy options, because if we think Congress is going to delay until the last minute, that kind of makes our options even smaller. Let's talk about the payroll tax for a minute. And we're just going to talk payroll taxes. We're not going to talk about other taxes. That's going to be like the third category. The cost of delay means the payroll tax increase, if we do it on the tax side, has to go up. So you'll see the tax increase. This is by percentage points from the 2012 trustees report, 2022, which was last year, but in the 23 report, I pulled the number out that says, what if we wait till trust fund depletion in 2034, which is what I think Congress is likely to do. That means we would have to raise payroll taxes by 4.15 percentage points. If you recall right now, you're paying 12.4. You pay 6.2, the employer pays 6.2, so this would be split evenly. But that means you'd be paying somewhere near, 16.55 percentage points. Add in Medicare taxes, which we haven't talked about solving Medicare yet. You're basically going to have a payroll tax rate of 20%. Add that if you're a self-employed individual, so you're paying both the employer side, that's 20% on you. Add in your federal income tax, which could be 35%, maybe 37%. If Biden gets his way, maybe it's 41%. Now you're getting really high. If you're in California, where they don't allow you to keep any of your income, your tax rate now is well over 60% at the margin for your high tax earners. That has a big disincentive on innovation, on small business creation, and anywhere along that sort of tax rate will have implications for labor. We've talked about the tax elasticity. We don't know, it does depend, like where you are in the income level, where you are in your career, but it will have some effects. And so one of the concerns I have when we talk about revenues is we should start thinking about this differently than just payroll. Because as a tax economist, I was always taught and told my students, tax the things you want less of, subsidize the things you want more of. If you're going to do something on tax policy, try to make sure you don't change behavior. Unless you're trying to change behavior. You want to tax cigarettes to change cigarette behavior? Fine. But if you want to encourage labor, you shouldn't tax it more. And I think that's my concern on the tax side, is we are getting to the point where you start doing little dollars here, they add up to big dollars over time. So when we think about the tax increases, we're going to be a little bit more novel, I think, in our third category discussion about what we might be able to do to raise revenues. But you can do tweaks. And the point of this is, and what Kathleen started doing, is she started doing one slice at a time to get up to solving 90%. We are losing our ability to solve this problem the longer we wait. In 2008, when I was the Deputy Commissioner for Social Security, I followed Andrew. And I was the Secretary of the Board of Trustees. So I signed 3 reports and worked on the working group. Back in 2008, and I'm not saying this was my policy option, but if we had just eliminated the taxable maximum for Social Security payroll taxes, that would have solved the 75-year solvency issue. Now you're getting about 40 to 60%, depending on whether you want to do a 75-year period or you want to count the 75th year of solvency. You're not doing it alone. She mentioned some things about getting 25%, right? We're getting piecemeal stuff. The point is, we probably can't do this all now on the tax payroll side. Now, they're going to be able to do it all on the benefit side either, which we'll get to next. But just trying to solve this on the payroll tax side is going to be a heavy burden on workers. Another individual last panel session mentioned AI. If AI is really going to be the transformative thing of this next generation, how is that going to impact labor? Not just low-wage labor, but even middle-class labor like accountants. You can see in reduced jobs, is it going to be productivity enhancing, or is it going to replace jobs? We don't know yet. But my point is, if you start making labor more expensive, you're going to have less of it. And that'll ultimately end up being less money going into trust funds, not more.
I like how you chose accountants and not economists, but
AI is not smart enough to replace us because we don't even know what the answers to our own questions are.
we can talk more about that later. So then as Jason alluded to, Kathleen talked through quite hopefully some discussions on payroll tax options and how we might move the needle on Social Security finances on the payroll tax options. Jason, can you talk us through some thoughts you might have on benefit changes?
So this is when you think about benefits, I'm going to pull something Bill said, because he's one of the only other people besides me who mentions that this is an insurance program. And I really appreciate that framing, because you were able to highlight things that I think are getting lost in the debate. When you think about insurance, there's a lot of public finance professors in the room. What do we insure against? Things that are high cost, low probability events. Right? Things like your house burning down, which some people know about personally, car accidents, things you can't necessarily afford to save for yourself, so you buy insurance for it. When we think about the old age insurance program, the whole idea was you had people who were outliving their savings because they had longevity risk, and they basically, it wasn't supposed to be a retirement program. It was supposed to be an old age insurance program. And we added other things in along the way. But it's now morphed into this sort of retirement program. And it wasn't designed that way, and that's why the cost has gone up. But we are now paying a heavy premium for that insurance. And you're paying it at different equitable rates. Different people get different benefits by race, by gender, and by income. So it is no longer necessarily definitely fair. Now you get to the benefit of adequacy issue. Again, going back to this chart, this is the gap we have to make up. So do we want to reduce that dotted line and bring it down a little bit and go back to an insurance mode? And we can do that. Some people have suggested a flat benefit model. Some have suggested taking higher income benefits, reducing them to bring up lower income benefits. That'll be a way to actually make it, again, more of an insurance type model. So I think we need to start thinking about how we design the program as an insurance program to make sure it has adequacy for people who need it, but doesn't pay overly too much to people who don't necessarily need it, even though they've paid into it. And if we start going with general revenue transfers, that's going to be probably even more important to think about what a flat benefit structure looks like. There's been a discussion of means testing. So we do not means test Social Security today, but we do have a backdoor means testing. We tax benefits on your 1040. If you're getting Social Security benefits that make over like $25,000 a year, we can tax up to 85% of them on your 1040. My guess is at some point on the revenue side, they're going to tax benefits 100% for certain income levels. But that's a way to avoid means testing, but still sort of mean test. But think about spousal benefits. Again, you brought this up, Bill, as well. We'll probably do something on the spousal benefit side to make sure it's more equal, and that will sort of reduce the outlays a little bit. The retirement age, one of the ones that comes up on the conservative side is raising the retirement age. This can be a benefit cut on one side, if you think about it, but I'm going to give you the flip side. I think, Karen, you mentioned that retirement age increase is a benefit cut. For people who are living longer than they are assumed to have lived, if you don't raise the retirement age, it's actually a benefit increase that was not planned for. So we need to think about what the retirement age means for certain people who are living longer than the program is expected. Higher wage people, better jobs in environments which is air conditioned, have a retirement savings plan outside of Social Security, and probably figure out some way to reduce the benefits for them and helping those who at the lower end have higher benefits. That kind of shifts that debate a little bit. But when we talk about the retirement age, it's not necessarily a benefit cut for everybody. Right? It basically could be a benefit increase if we don't change it for certain people. So keep that in mind. So I think we have to do something on the retirement age, but we've also lost the ability for that to solve the problem. When I was going through Steve Goss's actuarial numbers, he's the chief actuary for Social Security, and going through his provisions, and there was ones to raise the retirement age, and there's various ways you can do it. You can do it by every 3 months you raise it by, every year you raise it by 3 months, and you keep going forward. You can tweak it. Basically, you can solve roughly 40 to 60% the retirement age side. As soon as you start tweaking that, though, you get down to about 20, 25%. We mentioned the 83 reforms, the very first panel discussion today. 1983. What year is it now? 2023. How many years is that? 40. We are still implementing today the increase in the retirement age. We haven't got to 67 yet.
67.
I thought it was going to be 2027.
2022.
Is it this year it does it?
Last year, yeah.
All right, 40 years then. Took 40 years to do it. Do you want to take 40 years to do the next implementation? If you do that, then you got to do more on the different benefit side or on the tax side to make up for it.
You're both right. One of you is doing it by age 62, and one of you is doing it by age 67.
I'm doing 67.
67, she's doing it at 60.
Okay, so 67 is what I was thinking of. That's the full. All right, so it still goes up to 67. So that's the nub, though. So if you're trying to solve this, these numbers get bigger the longer we wait and the more we start tweaking to try to solve the problem. So we are at the point now we've delayed so long, I don't think we can just do this on the tax side, payroll tax side. I also don't think we can just do it on the benefit side. When we get to 2033, 2034, and someone says, oh, we can just raise the payroll tax by 4 pennies on the dollar, you're going to have Republicans say, that's a 33% tax increase. And they're going to start adding up all the taxes and get to your 60% marginal tax rate. You want to think you're going to have Congress? Can you imagine any Congress voting for a 25% benefit cut for Social Security across the board? I can't. The point here is this is the default. If nothing gets done, and we had a question of what actually happens if we get to this point, if we're there, Social Security has no borrowing authority by law. It can only pay out in benefits what it brings in revenues, which means either benefits get cut or they get delayed until enough cash comes in to make full payments, which would still be for people a cut because they may be getting a delay over the course of years. The default is not a tax increase. The default is a benefit cut. And I think we need to make sure we tell people that, because if they think that this is going to be just solved automatically, they're going to be wrong. And it's very important we consider that. So that's why I think the benefits have to be included in this conversation, but we have to do it in a way that's equitable, fair, and holds those harmless who need the most assistance.
Yeah, please.
I'd like to address the full retirement age increase issue specifically, and I have 3 points. One of them related to what Jason was just saying is that we want to avoid this 25% across the board benefit cut, and that's why we need to raise the retirement age. Well, what is raising the retirement age? So there's a proposal now, live proposal from the Republican Study Committee that would raise Social Security's full retirement age to 70. What does that mean? That's a 20% across the board benefit cut. So to avoid the 25% across the board benefit cut, why don't we instead implement a 20%? It doesn't add up to me. The other second point is one that's been made many times today, is that the justification for raising the retirement age is people, like Bill said, people are living longer. Which people are living longer? Where have these longevity gains happened over the last 40 years? Well, many people aren't living longer at all. And in fact, with these deaths of despair, we're really seeing some people living shorter lives than their mothers, fathers. And we are certainly seeing that the increase in longevity is concentrated at the top. If you're concerned about that, then I would propose that maybe you think about benefit cuts that are targeted at the top and not an across-the-board benefit cut that affects everyone. And then my third point has to do with, how much is this actually going to help Social Security solvency? Like Jason said, and other people have made this point as well, we're not going to implement an immediate benefit cut. It's going to be gradual. If anything, I think if we do raise the full retirement age again, it's going to be even more gradual than it was in 1983, based on what we're hearing now from Vice President Pence, who has proposed a full retirement age increase, Nikki Haley, and other people. They're talking, the Cassidy King Bipartisan Commission, or not commission, but gang, I guess.
Working group.
But they're talking about not making it effective for 35 years or more, for a generation. And so that means you're not going to see a dime of savings from this for a whole generation. So I think we're going to have to look at tax revenues to solve the immediate shortfall. We're probably going to be looking at general revenues, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But benefit cuts, just mathematically speaking, cannot be an important part of the short to medium term way to fill the gap. It's just not going to happen politically.
This is where the text on here is the numbers reflect tax increases and benefits in isolation. The odds are there's going to be some combination of benefit changes, tax changes, and then we're going to talk about the third potential options in a minute, probably because of politics. And one of the things, I also work in the retirement security field. I talk to financial planners, and they're always used to talking to their clients about market risk and sequence of return risk. And I'm telling them they got to talk to their clients now about political risk. Who's going to be in the White House in 2033, 2034? Who's going to be controlling Congress? What is the politics going to look like? I mean, we've been seeing it get worse, not better. Are we going to have more grandstanding going into trust fund depletion? There was Peter Orszag didn't want to answer that question that you asked, Mark, about what's going to happen because he's not sure what's going to happen. This is debt ceiling issue. This is one of those things where the Democrats wanted to do it on their own after the last midterm election. Bernie Sanders said, let's raise it to $100 trillion and be done with it. They didn't want to do it, even though it was after the election. This becomes our self-imposed crises we put on with various rules. And we're going to see the same thing, I think, happen as we get closer to trust fund depletion date. There's going to be a lot of posturing and a lot of divide, and we'll see what they do to react. But to your point, the longer we wait, the bigger the delta, but no one's going to interact and institute the delta all at once. They're not going to put in a 3% tax increase or a 20% benefit cut. They're going to do something moderate, which means you're pushing off the program's long-term changes for 40 or 50 years, and you still got to make up the gap in the short term and medium term.
And so I think this segues quite nicely into the next segment of the conversation that we had talked about, which, Jason, you've alluded to, and Kathleen, which is talking about some less traditional changes to the program that we might see that might help improve the financial situation. And so, Jason, I didn't know if you want to talk about investment
Let's
trust.
save that one for the end, because that'll be fun.
Okay, we'll save that one for the end. So then, Kathleen, I didn't know if you want
Sure.
to talk about some non-traditional sources of tax revenue.
Yeah, one thing that that has come up a number of times today is bringing some forms of general revenues or other forms of tax revenues into the system. And this actually is an idea that's been around for a while. That there are, there's one, Social Security is often discussed as part of a three-legged stool of retirement security, savings, pensions, and Social Security. And likewise, some people have recommended that the program itself be 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, instead of, it's essentially paid for by payroll taxes now with a bit of taxation of benefits, half and half on employers and employees. Some people have proposed we do 1/3 from the employer side payroll tax, 1/3 from the employees side, and then 1/3 from general revenues. And part of the policy justification for that is that Social Security has a pretty significant legacy debt, and that comes from the early years of the program. This program was famously first implemented in the middle of the Great Depression, and so they wanted to pay out benefits as soon as possible. They had only collected taxes for a couple of years when they started paying in those first benefits. Those beneficiaries got benefits for the rest of their lives. They paid in very little. And so the legacy debt that we're still paying now is a big part of the gap that we're seeing now. And so some people say, well, why aren't we using other novel, like actually Peter Orszag, one of his proposals in the past in his book with Peter Diamond was taking an enhanced estate tax and putting that revenue into Social Security to help pay off that legacy debt. Another thing is just bringing general revenues in general, and I think it makes sense to think about it that way. As we've discussed, Medicare, another incredibly popular, also social insurance program, it has significant general revenue financing, and that has not undermined political support for the program. That has not undermined people's feelings of ownership of their benefits or the fact that they earn those Medicare benefits just because it has general revenue financing. So I think we will, out of financial necessity, see general revenues as part of the solution, and I think it makes sense as a matter of policy.
This is one where 15 years ago, my choice architecture would be much different than it is today. I do think we've lost so much time that we no longer are going to be able to solve this within just the Social Security system itself. Peter mentioned that on payroll taxes or benefit cuts. So we've been having conversations about, are there ways to bring the middle together again on other forms of revenue? And without endorsing, we're just going to talk about what you could potentially think about doing, right? So one is an estate tax. I think when they had the $1 million exclusion, that was way too low. 13 for a single, 26 for married might be too high. There's probably something in between. But that gets into questions about what the incentives effects are for business. If you're trying to find a revenue source, you want one that you can tax, that won't change behavior and raises a lot of revenue. I'm becoming a bigger fan of a financial transaction tax. And there already is a model in place right now. When we sell, if you have E-Trade or Fidelity or Vanguard and you go sell a stock, you pay a very, very, very small percentage that goes to the SEC. It's right on your trade afterwards. No one really knows it's there. I keep bringing it up and people stare, like, I'm paying what to the SEC? Like, if you sold $10,000, you might have paid 46 cents. It's very small. You can start taxing these things for a financial transaction tax. The higher volume trading would get taxed a little bit, on volume more. That could be a revenue source for Social Security. And again, don't think of these as being something that has to solve all of it. You're now trying to solve pieces. There's been concern, though, and we've heard this about whether or not if you leave the financing and do something outside Social Security, will that ruin support for the program? To Kathleen's point, I don't think so. I think it's still, as long as there is some tie to an earned benefit, that you still have support for the program. We've heard the phrase, programs for the poor, poor programs, so not turning it into welfare. So having some connection to the payroll tax still makes sense. I'm just fearful that we can't rely on the payroll tax anymore to increase it because of the labor effects. So trying to find something outside of it. So a financial transaction tax, a carbon tax, looking at the estate tax. It also helps distributionally if you're thinking about who you want to tax. If you want to tax people on the higher end, those who have higher incomes and have higher assets and do higher trading and more volume trading would pay more into the program. So you wouldn't be hurting lower income people and you wouldn't be affecting labor force incentives either. I think we need to start being a lot more creative about how we think about this because we kind of run out of time.
So then related to, or I guess I should say less related actually to the obvious connection to Social Security finances today, and this topic has come up, is one of the number of workers in the country and immigration issues associated with that. So I didn't know if either one of you had any thoughts that you wanted to share on that.
So I've been talking with a colleague about trying to do something on the Social Security side. Maybe Andrew, we should talk on the side too. We're talking about tax increases, benefit cuts. What if we sort of flip it a little bit and look at labor force participation and the decline in labor force participation? What would we have to get back up to for that level to basically be enough to fund Social Security on the payroll tax side? Like, how many more workers do you need to have come back in, whether it's through immigration or just labor force participation? That allows us to have a different conversation about why aren't folks in the labor force? Is it childcare? Is it paid leave? Is it discrimination? Is it? That allows me to have a much different conversation that would help Social Security without talking about Social Security reform. So we're starting to noodle a little bit on what this might mean for thinking about getting workers back in. And someone earlier asked about immigration. We do need to have smart immigration policy. It is interesting thinking about, again, the polarization in this country. I still remember a time when Republicans liked having people show up here who wanted to work. You mentioned the idea about people tying to work, but work is a very important thing. Both parties love jobs. People love jobs. Jobs are great. We are now seeing this party divide in which people who want to come here to work and make their life better, because this is a country that allows and affords that, are no longer welcome by a party that used to welcome them. I don't know how we go back to that old Republican Party that says we want people to work. Smart immigration does help the trust funds, especially in the short end, because they pay payroll taxes, that helps the financing, and then overall, you basically have the actuarial, but it helps up front. We need to have smart immigration policy. We need to have smart labor policy and talk about what that means for labor force participation and how that could help trust fund balances.
I agree with everything Jason said. I also would add, immigration does help with the worker beneficiary ratio in the short run. It also helps in the longer run too, because on average, immigrants have a somewhat higher birth rate than native-born Americans.
Is it time to talk about investment trusts?
Let's have some fun.
Okay. So one of the other points we had discussed before coming here today was, and you had mentioned Cassidy King in this issue of investment trusts, and so I just wanted to tee that up for you.
And I don't know if other people know of it, or if that's more of an inside DC thing. Should we explain?
Probably inside.
Okay. Should we explain it? Do you want to explain it, or do you want me to?
Well, let me just tell you what the thought process is.
Yeah.
There have been proposals in the past to when Social Security was getting a surplus, allow them to invest in that surplus into equities, or at least marketable bonds. Right now, by law, they can only go into special issue treasuries, which are treasury bonds that pay a market rate. That's all they can do. So there's no equity premium. What if we allowed Social Security to invest trust fund assets in something besides treasury bonds? A diversified portfolio, which any sort of pension plan does as a fiduciary. We've kind of lost that ability to do just that because the trust fund balances are depleting. So an idea has come up about creating an investment trust. Do not call it a sovereign wealth fund, please. There's no sovereign, right? This is basically a system in which you have a trust that is independently run and managed.
There's also no wealth.
There will be creating wealth, in which the sole beneficiary is the Social Security trust funds, right? So it's not going to each beneficiary, it goes to the trust fund, so it pays back into the system and helps fill up. Again, we are trying to solve this gap, or at least part of it, with this trust fund. There is a model going on right now. It's called the Puerto Rico Pension Reserve Trust, which I am the chair of, and which Andrew helped set up and suckered me into running the thing. It has surplus money coming in right now from the bankruptcy of Puerto Rico's pensions. Now they're refinanced. There's basically about $1 billion a year coming into the trust. There is no withdrawals from the pension trust for about 10 years. So you get $1 billion a year, that's $10 billion over 10 that gets to grow. It's a defined pension plan that is closed, it's a closed plan now. As the current workers who are paying for current beneficiaries start to retire, who's going to pay for them? The payroll taxes start declining in revenues. The pension trust makes up the difference until the last beneficiary then dies, and any remaining revenue goes back to the Commonwealth. The sole beneficiary of the trust is the Commonwealth. They can only use it to pay benefits. There is a deed I had to sign. There's a plan of adjustment. There are articles which they specify how withdrawals can be made, who can make them, who has to approve it. Very complicated system designed for the public choice problems you're already thinking about now that having government invest in the market. If we are thinking that Congress is going to do nothing for 10 years, what is the most likely option they will do in 10 years? We've heard it from just about everyone here today, intergovernmental transfers. But what's that a word for? Borrowing. That just means more borrowing. That is now my baseline. I have to make up roughly $250 or $300 billion a year. I am short. If you're just going to borrow that money 10 years from now, why don't you just give it to me today? Let me start investing it. For scoring purposes, no equity premium. What I want is an upfront payment that is based on treasuries, so that anything above and beyond that, I get more money up front. I don't have to go chasing equity. But then I can start investing that money today, and I've got 10 years before trust fund depletion, and withdrawals have to start coming from the trust to make up the difference in the payroll tax. I'm not raising payroll tax rates. I'm not cutting benefits. I'm trying to make up the gap. This is where you start thinking about how this might work structurally, budgetarily, legally, independently. If you start doing like a payment, $300, $400 billion a year, each year for 5 years, then that money gets invested. It's not a one-time $1 trillion, $2 trillion shock in the market. It gets absorbed. Independently managed, RFP, transparency. We've got stuff on Puerto Rico I'm happy to share it. I've got 5 slides I can give to Mark or Gopi, and she can share them. John's already got a copy, so I'm going to get comments from him. But this is something we have to start being creative about, because if you want to avoid tax increases, benefit cuts, you're going to have to be more creative. And one idea is an investment trust. Mm-hmm. Now, it is still borrowing. Don't get me wrong. Now, we can just basically say we're going to assume that if we borrowed money in 10 years, that's just debt that keeps going. And my concern with that is I do think at some point, whether it's tomorrow, 2 years from now, 10 years from now, we are going to have a debt issue. Everyone's been calling for it, and so far it hasn't happened. But it doesn't mean it won't happen. Our debt to GDP levels looks like it's going to be unsustainable. Do you want a system in which you're making up that gap every year with additional borrowing with no end in sight? I don't think we do. And I'm going to be happy to have a bottle of wine out there and talk to all of you about the investment.
Yeah, I guess I would note, I noticed one word that you said when you were describing the Puerto Rico system, which is surpluses. You're investing surpluses, and when we talked about this last seriously as a country, it was when Social Security had annual surpluses, and now we're in deficits. And so we are talking about borrowing, and when we're talking about accruing this investment income over time, well, that money's locked up. We're not going to be using it to fill the gap. We're going to be waiting for it to accrue these returns. And so then that means even more borrowing. So I think when we think about this in today's context,
it should be, if you do it right, it should be less borrowing. Because if you wait 10 years, you're going to be borrowing $250 or $300 billion every year in perpetuity, as opposed to giving me 5 years worth of borrowing and then letting me invest it. Then I make up the gap.
Sure. I guess to put
it
in more concrete terms, there's this bipartisan group of senators working together now to think about Social Security in different ways. And I think it's great that they are doing this. And what's been reported is they're talking about borrowing $1.5 trillion and then locking it up in an escrow account and that's what they call it. They don't call it sovereign wealth fund. They call it an escrow fund. Locking it up in escrow for 50 to 60 years, at which point they will take the principal and the returns and repay the borrowing and also use it to fund Social Security in perpetuity. So this is, bringing more general revenues into the system. These borrowed funds would be general revenues, which is something, like I said, I'm open to. However, we're talking about a pretty massive amount of borrowing. Not only the $1.5 trillion upfront to invest, but also during those 50 to 60 years, funding that gap in the meantime. So it's not clear to me that this would fly, in a country where we're not even sure if we are going to pay the debts that we've already accrued, whether we are going to take on this massive new amount of debt. But if it is a way to break the impasse, then maybe we should think about how we could do it. I mean, I think we do have an impasse between, on the people are pretty hardened in their positions on the traditional options, on the payroll tax options and on the benefit cut options, and there are limitations to those options. And so I think it's good to start thinking about different ideas. But I think the major drawback to, well, there are few, that's one of the drawbacks to that. But that the massive amount of borrowing would be one that would give a lot of people
And you could
pause.
finance it with a financial transaction tax instead. So there are ways, but I think one of the issues we're going to have problems with thinking about solvency is I do not think Republicans are going to go back to an era which they're going to allow payroll taxes to be a surplus used that goes into treasury bonds that just finance the other part of government again. So I think those days are long gone politically. So we're either going to be a pay-as-you-go system going forward completely, and you're going to have to adjust payroll taxes and benefits to basically be solvent each year. There's not going to be a surplus. Or you got to be creative and create some sort of wealth through an investment scheme that does allow you to have a trust.
So let's talk about time frame for a minute. So Jason, you were just talking about solvency, and in the 1980s, for instance, there was a discussion. The discussion was largely centered around 75-year solvency, and that was the time frame on which people were focused. As we've heard throughout the day, the situation then was very different, and the challenges that the Social Security program was facing then were very different from what it is facing now. And one of the other things we've talked about is when you're looking out as long as 75 years, compounding in reasonable differences or relatively small differences in assumptions about fertility or GDP growth or what have you can make a huge difference in what this gap that you're seeing 75 years from now. So, but there's less uncertainty as we come closer in, which is both for good and ill, less uncertainty as we come closer in. And so should we be thinking about something that is different from a 75-year window? Should we thinking about 25 years or something shorter like that?
Again, if you had asked me 15 years ago, I would have said no. You asked me today, the answer is yes, because we haven't done anything. We need to figure out what, again, we can reduce the barriers to getting some sort of action on a bipartisan basis. And if that is trying to get something that gets the needle in the right direction, so we get 25 years and we start showing the improvement, I think that's a good step. And again, the idea to take, for example, payroll tax. If we decided it needed to go up 4 percentage points and that was 75-year solvency, then why don't we start with raising it 0.1% each year, get 25 years in, and then as you start getting to year 20, maybe you do the rest of it because people are already used to that 0.1% increase and they're not going to notice it, so you then do it at that point in time. So I think we start thinking about how we actually can get over the starting line before we have to worry about getting to the finish line. And we can't even get over the starting line right now.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, as Peter pointed out, predicting the future is really hard, and we don't really know what the 75-year gap is. And so we're not going to solve for the 75, I mean, let's not kid ourselves. We're not going to solve for the 75-year gap, even if we try. We just don't know. There's way too much uncertainty here. But also, I thought Bill raised some really good points, too, about how much things have changed since 1983. When you don't legislate on something so important for 40 years, then these trends overtake you. Like the changes in longevity by income, for example, that the 1983 legislators did not account for that because they didn't know about it. But we know about it now, and we've actually known about it for some time now. Like that report that Peter did, I think was like 15 years ago. So we've known about this for some time, but we didn't grapple with it as a country. How are we going to deal with this differential mortality? What are the implications of it? And and other things too. Again, Bill bringing up with different patterns in marriage and women's workforce participation and caregiving. Those things are not well accounted for in our system. It's a very archaic notion about a male worker being the higher earner, the female worker taking a long time off for caregiving. That's true for some families, but for a lot of families, it's not. Where there's higher divorce rate now than there was back in the 1930s, or just people not marrying at all. And these are benefits that are based on marriage. And also with caregiving as well. That's really changed. With women's earnings are often much more similar to their partners. And so I think we need to think more about those trends by gender as well. And when you don't legislate for 40 years, you have a very different labor market, very different caregiving, very different demographics and economics. And so it really makes sense to actually do it more often. I think we should do it more often.
Yeah, I was sensitive to Peter's comment about you got like this once every 30, 40 year time frame to make tax changes or benefit changes, that you need an event to do it all at once. But then also, again, the only thing I'm certain about in 75 years is I'll likely be dead. And you start seeing the progressivity changes, technology changes, environmental predictions are hard, especially when they're about the future.
Yeah, exactly.
So maybe we are smarter thinking about this in 25-year chunks and making progress. Because again, we need to get over the starting line, and that's been the hardest part. I want to switch to something just because I want to get in, because we have a little bit before we have to go Q&A. We've been having discussions about the politics and how hard it is to get people to come together, both culturally and politically. But there are ways to start. And Deb's at AARP, which they usually don't want any sort of benefit changes. It's hard sometimes to get to the table on things, but they've been a really good partner on a lot of issues, including the one I'm going to talk to you about. Kathleen and I have talked about this. There are things we can do to help people in retirement on the framing side. And Jay, we brought this up this morning, so I want to just do one quick thing, and then we'll sort of go back to this. Claiming age is really important, but it's confusing. Nearly half of Americans mistakenly believe that they claim early, their benefit will automatically go up once they reach the full retirement age. Communication is poor. Again, we talk about the early eligibility age, and when I was at the agency, I would go do surprise visits to field offices. And I would ask people, why are you here? Getting Social Security. How old are you? 62. When do you think you're going to die? 82, 84. Oh, so you have enough money to last 20 years in retirement? No, I didn't say that. They paused. Somehow thinking 62 to 82. 82 is a number that was in their head, but they didn't think that was 20 years of retirement. They're not thinking about that. So there is actually now legislation, bipartisan legislation, which we've all worked on and supported, that would actually change how we talk about the claiming age. It is still the modal age people claim, 62, right? 9.5% claim at 70 plus, but almost 30% claim at 62. It's the most popular age. What if we change the name? We're no longer going to call it the early eligibility age. We're going to call it the minimum benefit age. Full retirement age. Peter called it the normal retirement age. There's normal and there's full. What does normal retirement mean anymore? What does it mean to be fully retired if you're working part? What does that mean? We're going to call it the standard benefit age. And retirement with maximum delayed retirement credits. That's a mouthful. How about maximum benefit age? Imagine you're now a beneficiary walking into Social Security, and so you're 62 and someone says, oh, you're here to claim your minimum benefit. I'm sorry, what do you mean minimum? Can I get more? How do I get more? You just started a discussion. I'm not saying everyone can claim at 62 or can delay and claim at 70. People need, but having that conversation is so important. Even if it means delaying claiming by 2 months or 1 year. This is the administrative stuff we were working on 10, 15 years ago that we're now starting to see in legislation, and it's bipartisan. We can start doing this. Maybe we can start getting over that start line on the other stuff. So again, I work for the Bipartisan Policy Center. It is the only organization registered in the District of Columbia with the word bipartisan in its title. As an economist, it's either a supply problem or a demand problem or both. But it tells you how hard it is to get some things in Congress done right now. We are making progress. We can start the process along. I think that's why, going back to 25 years, we start moving the needle a little bit. Momentum, right? It's easier to push something that's already moving than it is to push something that's stopped completely. And this is the way we're doing it to start.
That's just because CBO is nonpartisan.
And it's the Congressional Budget Office. It's not even in your title anyway.
Yeah, fine, fair enough. Points well made. So now we get to turn to questions from the audience. So let's go ahead with questions. Don't scratch your head, you might get called on. Go ahead, go Pete.
So I wondered, this is kind of related to the window and should it be 75, 25 years, but could you comment on things like the Trust Act, which would trigger some kind of, I think they called it a rescue committee, if the trust funds were projected to be insolvent in like a 14-year window, and would that help us get to a point where we're making incremental changes, or is that?
Want to go first, or should
Yeah.
I honestly think it's a weird idea. Like, you're a United States senator. You're passing a law to make yourself pass a law. Like, just propose something. If you want to propose something, propose it. And let's just do it through, we have an ordinary process, we have a committee structure, we have ways of doing things. Just do it. Like, I could see if I were calling for a commission, but why would a United States senator be calling for a commission when they actually have the power to legislate on this? I don't understand it.
I think one of these, what it does is it raises awareness of the issue for the public. The problem is it's usually designed in a way that it fails. And you can see the Simpson-Bowles Commission and others, Congress still wants to be able to vote on it, but they don't put power in the hands of people to do it to actually make a decision. So if you're going to do some sort of Trust Act type thing, it would have to be something that says, okay, if they get it done, it goes automatically to the floor of the House and the Senate, and it's an up or down vote. That would have to be part of the act. Otherwise, you're just wasting time. And we've had discussions amongst many of us in this room about whether or not we got asked to serve on one, if we would. And the answer is no. Because I think it's a waste of time the way they set it up. It's not set up for success, it's set up for failure. And to your point, this is where, when are we going to have politicians have the courage to actually make reform? And that's the biggest problem. There's two down here.
Right here.
And then Bill.
I'll pass my time to John first.
Well, Jason, I have not, Jason sent me stuff on Puerto Rico and his investment trust idea, and I have not had time to look at it. But let me ask the following. Say I was short of money, and I had an idea, I'll borrow money and invest it. And that will make me less short of money.
Right.
Maybe. So there's certainly risk of doing that, and the risk that I will actually be in worse shape, not better shape, from having done that. And so I'm just trying to figure out whether your investment trust, is it kind of based on a stocks for the long run kind of argument that I'm borrowing money, investing in equities, and in the long run I'll certainly be ahead, which, by the way, that's not what I subscribe to. But tell me, am I going wrong here? But it just, what bothering me is it doesn't seem to apply to people. That is, I don't think somebody who's short on money can get ahead by borrowing and investing. So why can the government or Social Security get ahead with what sounds like that strategy?
So I think part of this, when you think about it, is one, when you think about the pension plans for state and local, they've been banking on the equity premium. That's where they got in trouble. So basically they'll say, hey, we'll borrow, and I'll give you 6%, John, for $1 today, because I guess I can make 10%.
Right.
And they don't, and they're worse off. So the way the Puerto Rico pension trust was set up is the math works if we return a 4.5% nominal on average per year. I don't have to chase equity premium. Right now I'm doing it on government paper alone. Now, so the upfront, the discount rate, if John Ross not here anymore, he left. The discount rate is very important how you set this up, right? CBO will not score an equity premium. They're just going to basically say it's going to be basically government bonds. So you have to have the discount rate separated so the upfront money's right. The second thing is the borrowing. Now, for the unified budget, it's borrowing. If you pull out Social Security and think about it separate from it as off budget, the money going in would be basically additional revenues. That would be its revenues. So it'd be like me telling you, John, I'm not borrowing, I'm giving you $1.5 trillion to invest. And that'd be like you would invest if you were an individual. So now you're not borrowing to catch up. You've been given money to invest to get ahead. And so this is where when I talk about the investment trust, I don't think, my baseline right now is that the federal government is going to bail out Social Security with borrowing.
So why not borrow now instead of borrow later?
Yes, and have that be a gift to Social Security, if you will. Yeah.
I understand.
Okay.
So why not create another tier of another age tier? Why not have a super premium benefit level at age
Delayed to 80?
72, 73? I mean, look we did it with IRA withdrawals. We've pushed that out.
Oh, like
right?
a later,
Yeah.
your monthly benefit keeps going up?
Yeah, well, you could have another tier if your maximum benefit today was at 70, maybe you make the maximum benefit be at 72. Would that
Well, I
make a
think
difference?
Jay's graph this morning was really telling, showing us that it's mostly high-income people who are doing that.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm not really that interested in helping high-income people maximize their Social Security benefits. That's not one of my highest goals in doing this kind of work. I think if anything, I think if we are looking toward benefit cuts, I'm looking more toward how can we address this rising inequality? How can we, have higher income, higher lifetime earners contribute more to the system? Or if we're cutting benefits, then maybe trim benefits for higher income workers. So yeah, I guess I don't really see that as a solution to what we
Well,
need.
if I might just say a rejoinder on that, it's not clear to me that you would be helping high-income people maximize their benefits, at least from a lifetime benefit standpoint.
It would be neutral from a lifetime.
They would perhaps be actually kind of stupid to do it. But if they're going to continue to work because work provides other benefits, I think
It would be
people want to stay
actuarially,
engaged.
according to
Yeah.
the current formula, it would be actuarially neutral.
Yeah.
So with respect to monthly benefits, it would be a higher benefit. But over the course of an average lifetime, it would be a higher benefit. But because of this rising inequality in longevity, a higher income person who is more able to delay their claim, as Jay showed this morning, would actually, on average, live longer than average. So it actually would be maximizing benefits for higher income retirees, which I think is the opposite of the direction where we should be going.
So the head of the organization has a question, so we're going to go to Mark.
All right, if I ask a question. So I know I've asked more than my share of questions, I apologize. But I love this stuff so much. So I guess I just have a question. So we're in Silicon Valley. And in Silicon Valley or near Silicon Valley, there is a disproportionate share of the ultra wealthy people in this country. And suppose that one day, one of those individuals woke up and just decided, you know what, I view this, how we deal with this, as a threat to America's economic vitality. Like, it's kind of amazing if you look over the last 30 years how much better the US has done economically than the typical industrialized country. We've done poorly on inequality, all sorts of ways, but just in terms of economic growth, really. So suppose that no view on should it be tax, should it be benefit, but you just wanted to, you had your billions and billions of dollars and you wanted to help your country because you love your country. And I'm just trying to think, I guess you three leading thinkers about Social Security reform, what could a person like that do? Could a person like that just offer like, you know what, I'm going to give $10 million in campaign contributions to every member of the House of Representatives and the Senate that signs a bill that solves Social Security's financing problems for 50 years.
I think you can buy votes. I think that's still illegal.
No, okay, no, but I'm just trying to think outside the box.
It's not like the idea.
I'm trying to think outside the box. Not even, it's not partisan. It's not saying raise taxes. It's not saying lower benefits. I'm just trying to think outside. If you're one of these ultra wealthy people who love your country and you're trying to think about how can you help, because the ultra wealthy are not very, they're not leaning into this issue. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe they are behind the scenes, but I'm just trying to understand, because I think there are a lot of people who love, you know what I mean, who want this thing to be solved, and they don't know the answer, but there's no sense of urgency. So I'm just trying to think of some forcing event that prevents us from going to the 2033, let's just finance it out of general revenue. And we're not asking, you know, my 15-year-old daughter and her generation, is that what you guys want us to do? Do you know what I mean? Like that is they don't get a vote in this, because I do feel like there's this intergenerational issue that we haven't touched on a lot today.
That's the default. That sort of Andrew's saying he's not worried about his benefits.
I don't know. I'm not literally suggesting they buy votes. Once again, I don't even know what the answer is.
You want to cut the breadpoint for poor people. You want to buy votes. You're just batting off.
I know. It's true. So, but can you?
It's so much more emotionally satisfying, Mark, to just tax it out of them instead of having to do it this way.
No, but I just, like, if you love your country and you view this as a threat to the economic health of the country, and you're like, how can I help?
I do think paying more taxes should be on the table. Today I focused only on payroll tax options, you know, in my initial remarks.
Yes.
But I think there's a lot of room to have wealthy people in this country pay more in taxes. And that could go towards Social Security and could go to other, you know, really important national needs. And I think, you know, my graph at the beginning was about increasing inequality in wages, but the real inequality, the big changes are happening not in wage income, but in other forms of income. And so I think we need to think about that. And I think one possibility for that, which addresses not only the fact that, you know, our higher income people and our higher wealth people are getting their income in non-wage compensation, and this generational question that you brought up is thinking about something like a net investment income tax. So we already have that in Medicare. Well, sort of. It's complicated, but that would tax. You know, there's a for Medicare payroll tax, there's instead of the capped tax that we have in Social Security, there's no payroll tax cap, and not only that, but there's a somewhat higher tax rate on higher earning workers. And in order to address this fact that many of our highest income people are getting a lot of their compensation through investment income. There's also this net investment income tax of 3.8%, same as the high wage Medicare payroll tax. And that addresses two problems. One, it brings in a lot of revenue. And the other is this generational thing that you're saying. You know, the baby boomers really they're not going to be tapped for this. They're not going to have their benefits cut because they're going to be protected. They're not going to have their payroll taxes increased because they're moving out of the labor force. But they actually do have significant investment income. And so this is a way that we can make the older generations be part of the financial solution for Social Security and our other national needs as well.
And I don't know how to, the educational, you have like foundations, like Peterson Foundation has theirs, they're putting money into educational fiscal campaigns as well. I don't know how you get the kitchen table conversation back again in middle America so they actually want to understand this stuff.
But they do want it.
Well, but no,
it's always at the top of, I mean, they do want it.
When you survey, but when you go ask them questions, they don't know, they don't understand it, which means
well, they might not understand.
We're not doing our job. Again, I don't want to say our job is to go out. We are educators, right? We're basically educators, but how do we actually help transmit the information? And I'm not trying to say people, they're busy. The transaction cost of learning everything about fiscal policy and Social Security when you're in your 20s and 30s, when you've got kids, you've got a job, they don't have the time. And this goes into the idea, even thinking about like having discussions now on the Hill about work requirements for SNAP benefits. Some people, even if it's a good philosophical idea, they're busy, they're constrained mentally, they're constrained with work. Sometimes they can't figure out how to fill out the forms. And you're then trying to say, how do you have these conversations? They know potentially something has to be done, but they don't know all the options. And I think that's a big challenge we have, is getting America to understand the urgency now. I don't think you ask them in a survey, of course they want to reform Social Security. But when you do these poll questions, I've seen questions like we did at the National Academy of Social Insurance. One was, would you be willing to pay 2 cents more, 2 pennies to save Social Security? If you ask me, are you willing to pay 33% more in taxes? The answer is no. So it changes on the framing. And so I think we really have a lot of work to do. And I don't know how to.
Okay, I'm going to get fired from my job as moderator. So, sorry, we're out of time for questions. I'm so sorry.
But we will be outside at the reception.
We will, yes, and we're standing between people in the reception, so we have to move to the reception. So I will just say, so I think, Gopi, you had some closing remarks, or maybe Mark, I'm not quite sure. But thank you, everybody, for your attention to this, the last session of the day. Very much appreciate it. Thank you both to Kathleen and Jason.
Thank you so much. That was a great last session to end on, and it doesn't have to end the conversation because we will have a reception in just a few moments. So I just wanted to kind of highlight some of my big takeaways from the day. I mean, I think that the rising life expectancy inequality is just something new that is going to have to be contended with when these discussions finally kind of come to the table. The uncertainty in the program and thinking about how to address that going forward, I think, is also a huge issue. And the partisanship that we've seen, and I think leaves me somewhat less optimistic that something is going to happen in the near term. But I want to say that the dialogue that we've had today and the creative solutions and the way that we've been able to discuss these issues, even when we don't agree on everything, I think gives me some hope that when it does get discussed, that there will be a lot of experts there to provide some solutions. So thank you, everyone, for that. We are going to just close on this poll. You can go 2 slides over. It's the same thing. Okay, yes. So we are going to do the same kind of 3-question thing in just a minute. But while you are completing that, I just want to give a series of thank yous to everyone who made this day possible. The panelists and the moderators, thank you so much for being here. I think we filled all the planes coming from DC yesterday, but we got a great group here, and I think some of you met each other in California, even though you've been working in the same space in DC, so I'll consider that a win. Of course, the CPER staff has been amazing at getting this day just rolling smoothly, and dealing with any kinds of hiccups with such grace. And especially I want to thank Aline Kadiwal, who just did an amazing job with everything leading up to today, and thought of all of the different contingencies that could have could have occurred in the lead up to today's event. So let's thank Aline. And thanks again to Mark for choosing to highlight this important topic and your support for the event. I think it was very prescient of you to think about this topic. I think almost a year ago we first started talking about planning this policy forum, and I think it was a hugely successful event. So now why don't we switch over to the results? We have some results coming in even as we speak. And let's just see how people changed or did not change some of their views on these topics. Okay, so I'm going to say that we, if anything, went to, this is a more important problem to solve this afternoon than it was this morning. 97% are in the important or extremely important category. Maybe that is just a reflection of who is still here at 4 o'clock relative to who was here at 10 a.m., but I'll take it. So on the next page, I guess I'm eyeballing the distribution here, but I'm going to say it's pretty similar, maybe a little bit more central than it was in the morning in terms of splitting the ways to achieve solvency between benefit reductions and tax increases. Although, as we learned today, these are not just the only two solutions on the table. And really, it's more multidimensional than this picture suggests. And what did we take away from today? Still coming in, but solutions, I like that. So inequality and solutions, creative policy. So thank you all for your part in making today's event a success, and I hope you will join us.